The plate slipped from Grace's hands the moment the horn sounded, and she caught it against her chest one breath before it hit the stone floor. Because in the Black Moon Pack, a broken plate meant a night without food, and a night without food meant a girl too weak to work, and a girl too weak to work did not last long. The horns kept blowing. 3 long notes, then 3 more. Grace had lived in the pack house for 18 years, and she had never heard the horns blow 6 times. 6 meant royalty. 6 meant the Alpha King himself was coming through the gates, and he was coming tonight. The kitchen went silent. Old Nora, the cook, dropped her spoon into the soup and whispered a prayer. The younger maids grabbed each other's arms, and Grace stood very still in the corner, holding the plate against her chest, feeling her heart slam against her ribs like a fist on a locked door. Do not cry. Whatever happens tonight, do not cry. Those were the last words her mother ever said to her. Grace had been 6 years old, kneeling beside a bed in a cold little room, watching her mother's face turn gray. Any other mother would have said, I love you. Any other mother would have said, be brave, or be good, or remember me. But Grace's mother had used her final breath on a warning. She had gripped Grace's small wrist with fingers that were already losing their warmth, pulled her close, and whispered, your tears are not like other tears, my love. They carry something old, something from my blood and my mother's blood before me. If they ever fall on the wrong person, the world will change, and it will not change kindly. Promise me, you will never cry. Grace had promised. And then her mother's hand had gone loose, and her eyes had gone still, and 6-year-old Grace had sat there with a chest full of grief, so heavy it felt like drowning, and she had not let a single tear fall. Not one. Not at the burial. Not in the empty room afterward. Not in the 12 years since. People in the pack thought she was strange because of it. The heartless orphan, they called her. The girl made of stone. When the older boys knocked her food into the dirt, she did not cry. When the head maid struck her knuckles with a wooden spoon for working too slowly, she did not cry. When she turned 16, and the pack celebrated every other girl's coming of age with flowers and singing, and no one even remembered her birthday, she did not cry. She simply pressed everything down, deep down, into a locked room inside her chest, and turned the key, and kept working. 12 years of swallowed tears. 12 years of a locked room getting fuller and fuller. Sometimes, late at night, Grace could almost feel it straining against her ribs, like water pressing against a dam. The kitchen door burst open. The head maid, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Crane, swept in with her skirts flying. Every one of you, into the main hall, now, she snapped. Clean aprons, clean hands, eyes down. The Alpha King has arrived early, and if a single one of you embarrasses this pack in front of him, I will make you wish you had never been born. Grace set down the plate with shaking fingers and followed the others. The main hall of the Black Moon Pack House was the largest room Grace had ever seen, but that night it felt small, because fear takes up space, and the hall was full of it. The entire pack had gathered. Warriors stood along the walls with their backs straight and their jaws tight. The Alpha of Black Moon, a broad gray-haired man named Alpha Gerald, stood at the front with his family, and Grace noticed that his hands, which had signed orders and settled disputes and ruled this pack for 30 years, were trembling. Everyone was afraid. Everyone. And then the doors opened, and Grace understood why. The Alpha King did not walk into the room. He arrived, the way a storm arrives, the way winter arrives, changing the air before he even crossed the threshold. His name was Adrian, and every wolf on the continent knew it, the way they knew the word danger. He was young for a king, no more than 30, tall and dark-haired, dressed in black without a single ornament, because a man like that did not need gold to announce him. His face might have been handsome, if there had been anything alive in it. There was not. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, pale gray and empty, and they moved across the gathered pack the way a blade moves across a whetstone. They said he had taken the throne at 19 after his father's sudden death. They said he had put down 4 rebellions before his 25th birthday. They said he had not smiled in public in over a decade, that he slept alone in a locked tower, that he trusted no one, loved no one, needed no one. They said many things about King Adrian, and Grace, standing in the servant line with her eyes properly lowered, believed all of them at once. Alpha Gerald stepped forward and bowed so low his beard nearly touched the floor. Your Majesty, he said, his voice cracking. You honor us. We were told to expect you next month. If we had known, we would have prepared a proper welcome, a feast. I am not here for a feast, the king said. 5 words, that was all. But his voice was so cold and so quiet that the entire hall seemed to lean away from it. Alpha Gerald's mouth opened and closed. I am here, the king continued, walking slowly down the center of the hall. For the tribute this pack has failed to send for 2 seasons. Grain, silver, and workers for the royal household. My steward wrote to you 3 times. You answered none of the letters, so I decided to collect in person. Grace watched Alpha Gerald's face lose its color. The whole pack knew the truth, even if no one said it aloud. The harvest had been poor. The silver had been spent. Gerald had gambled that the king, busy with troubles in the north, would forget one small pack at the edge of the territory. The king did not forget things. That was another thing they said about him. Your Majesty, Gerald stammered. The harvest, you see, the rains came late, and we— Spare me, the king said, and something in those 2 words made Gerald stop talking, as suddenly as if a hand had closed around his throat. The king reached the front of the hall and turned, his black coat sweeping behind him, and for the first time he faced the entire pack directly. I will take double grain next season, he said. I will take the silver in installments, with interest, and I will take the workers tonight. My steward will choose them. A ripple of quiet horror moved through the crowd. Being taken to the royal household was not an honor. Servants who went to the king's palace were rarely heard from again. Not because they were harmed, the rumors said, but because the palace swallowed people. It was a cold place, ruled by a cold man, and the ones who went there simply faded, like letters left in the rain. A thin man in gray stepped forward from the king's guard, holding a ledger. He began to walk the servant line, studying faces the way a farmer studies livestock. You, he said to a strong boy from the stables. You, to one of the laundry women. You, to a young footman who made a small broken sound when the finger pointed at him. Grace kept her eyes down, and her breathing slow. She was small. She was quiet. She had spent her whole life being invisible, and invisibility had kept her alive. Just let him pass, let him pass. The steward passed her. And then the king spoke. That one, he said. Grace did not look up at first, because it did not occur to her, not for 1 second, that he could mean her. Then the hall went so quiet she could hear the candles burning, and Mrs. Crane hissed her name under her breath, and Grace lifted her head, and the alpha king of every pack on the continent was looking directly at her with those frozen gray eyes. Her stomach dropped through the floor. The steward hurried back down the line, confused. Your Majesty, this one is only a kitchen girl, an orphan. She has no particular skills, no family name, nothing that I did not ask for her history, the king said. He was still looking at Grace, and there was something in his gaze she could not read, a faint narrowing, as if he had heard a sound no one else could hear, and was trying to find its source. I said that one. Later Grace would wonder about that moment for years. Why her? What he had seen, or sensed, or felt, whether some old thread of fate had already been pulling tight between them, long before either of them understood what they were to each other. But in that moment, standing in the hall with her whole life collapsing quietly around her, she only understood one thing. She was leaving, tonight, with him. Mrs. Crane shoved a cloth bag into her hands 20 minutes later. It held everything Grace owned, a spare dress, a wooden comb, and a small silver locket, dented and old, the only thing her mother had left her. It did not open. It had never opened, no matter how Grace had tried over the years, and she had tried with knives, with pins, with her own desperate fingernails on the nights when missing her mother felt like a wound that would not close. The locket stayed sealed, like a mouth keeping a secret. She wore it anyway. It was all she had. The pack gathered in the yard to watch the chosen servants climb into the wagon. Nobody said goodbye to Grace. Old Nora gave her a quick, sad look and pressed a heel of bread into her hand, and that was the only kindness the Black Moon Pack offered her after 18 years of her life spent inside its walls. Grace climbed into the wagon and sat down among strangers. Ahead, through the wagon's open front, she could see the king mounting a huge black horse. He did not look back at the pack house. He did not look at the servants he had just taken. He looked only at the dark road ahead, and his face in the torchlight was as unreadable as stone. The wagon lurched forward. The gates of the only home Grace had ever known passed over her head and fell behind, and the night swallowed the road. The other servants wept quietly around her. The laundrywoman cried for the sister she was leaving. The stable boy cried into his sleeve, trying to hide it. And Grace sat in the middle of them with dry, burning eyes and a chest that ached like a bruise, doing what she had done every day for 12 years, holding the dam, keeping the promise. She did not know it yet, but she was riding toward the very thing her mother had feared. Somewhere in the dark ahead stood a palace of gray stone, and inside it waited the wrong person, the most wrong person in all the world, the one man upon whom her tears must never, ever fall. The wagon rolled on, the wind rose, and far away, on the highest tower of the royal palace, a night bird lifted its head, looked toward the east road as if it could feel something coming, and flew away into the dark. The royal palace did not look like the palaces in stories. There were no golden roofs, no bright flags, no gardens spilling over with roses. It rose out of the northern hills like a mountain that had been carved into the shape of a fortress, gray stone stacked on gray stone, towers like clenched fists against the sky. When the wagon passed through the outer gates at dawn, Grace felt the temperature drop, and she could not tell if it was the northern air or the place itself. The new servants were processed like packages, names written down, hands inspected, rules recited by a bored under-steward who had clearly said them 1,000 times. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not enter the east wing. Do not look at the king. Never, under any circumstances, touch the king. Grace listened to that last rule and almost wanted to laugh, as if a kitchen orphan would ever be close enough to the Alpha King to touch him. As if the sky needed a rule telling the dirt to keep its distance. She was assigned to the lower kitchens, and for 3 days, the palace swallowed her, exactly the way the rumors promised. She scrubbed pots before sunrise. She carried water up staircases that never seemed to end. She slept in a narrow bunk in a room with 11 other girls who had learned, in this place, to speak only in whispers. The palace was enormous and crowded, and somehow, the loneliest place Grace had ever been. The servants did not sing while they worked. The guards did not joke in the corridors. Everyone moved quickly and quietly, like people living beside a sleeping bear. And over it all, unseen but always felt, hung the presence of the king. Grace glimpsed him only once in those first days, from a distance, crossing the great courtyard with his guards at dusk. Every single person in that courtyard, dozens of them, stopped moving at the same time and lowered their heads. And the silence that followed him was so complete that Grace could hear his boots on the stones from 100 feet away. He looked at no one. He spoke to no one. He passed through his own palace like a stranger, and the palace held its breath until he was gone. That should have been the whole of her life. Pots and water and whispers, years of it, until she faded like the letters in the rain. But on the 4th day, a fever swept through the servant quarters, and half the upper floor maids fell ill, and Mrs. Hale, the head of the royal household, came down to the lower kitchens looking for replacements. Her cold eyes moved across the kitchen girls and stopped on Grace. "You," she said. "You look clean. Can you carry a tray without spilling it? Good, follow me." And that was how Grace, 4 days after arriving, found herself climbing toward the forbidden floors of the palace, with her heart in her throat. Mrs. Hale was a tall, iron-haired woman, with a voice like a closing door, and she despised Grace on sight. Perhaps it was the plainness of her, or the pack she came from, or simply that Mrs. Hale needed someone to despise the way other people needed air. She gave Grace the worst duties of the upper floors, the heaviest trays, the longest corridors, the fireplaces that had to be cleaned while the ashes were still hot. And she watched her constantly, waiting, the way a cat watches a bird that has not yet noticed the danger. On Grace's second morning upstairs, it happened. She was carrying a tray of crystal glasses down the long gallery, a corridor lined with tall windows on one side and portraits of dead kings on the other. Her arms ached from the night before, her fingers were raw, and she was concentrating so hard on the tray that she did not see the edge of the carpet that had been turned up, folded back at the corner, directly in her path. Later she would remember that Mrs. Hale had walked that gallery, not 2 minutes ahead of her. Later she would understand, but in that moment there was only the catch of her shoe, the sickening tilt of the world, and the sound, the terrible bright sound, of crystal exploding across the stone floor. For one heartbeat the gallery was silent. Then Mrs. Hale was there, appearing so quickly she could only have been waiting, and her face was lit with something that looked horribly like joy. "You clumsy, worthless creature," she breathed. "Do you know what those glasses cost? Do you know they belonged to the king's grandmother?" She seized Grace by the wrist and yanked her up from the floor, and her other hand rose in the air, and Grace, who had been struck before, many times, by many hands, did what she had always done. She went still. She locked the room in her chest. She prepared to endure. The blow never fell. "Enough," said a voice from the end of the gallery. Grace would remember afterward how fast Mrs. Hale changed. The raised hand vanished behind her back. The blazing face went smooth and servile in the space of a single second, like a mask dropping over a mask. She turned and sank into a deep bow, and Grace, turning with her, felt every drop of blood leave her face. The king stood 20 feet away, flanked by 2 guards, a sheaf of papers in one hand. He had clearly been passing through on his way to somewhere else. His frozen gray eyes moved from Mrs. Hale to the shattered crystal, to Grace, and Grace dropped her gaze to the floor so fast her neck hurt, because rule number 3 was, "Do not look at the king," and she had just broken it with her mouth hanging open. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Hale purred, "forgive the disturbance. This girl has destroyed the heirloom crystal through pure carelessness. I was about to discipline her." Silence. Grace stared at the floor, at the glittering ruin of the glasses, at the toes of the king's black boots as they came closer, unhurried, stopping just at the edge of the broken pieces. She could feel his gaze on the top of her bowed head like a weight. "Discipline," the king repeated. His voice was quiet and without any feeling at all. "In my grandmother's day, a servant who destroyed royal property lost her position and was turned out of the gates before nightfall." He paused. The pause went on long enough for Grace to feel her whole future balancing on it, the road, the winter, an orphan with nowhere on earth to go. Then he said, "But my grandmother also believed that anything truly valuable does not shatter the first time it is dropped." The crystal failed the test. "Note it in the inventory and buy plainer glasses. They will match this household better." Mrs. Hale blinked. "That is, Your Majesty is merciful. I will of course still see that the girl is properly—" "The girl," the king said, "is not the one who folds the carpets in this gallery." The words were spoken in the same flat, indifferent tone as everything else, and it took Grace a moment to understand what they meant, that he had seen the turned-up carpet, that he had understood everything in a single glance. The trap, the waiting, the raised hand. Mrs. Hale's face went white, then gray. She bowed so low she nearly folded in half. And then the king looked at Grace, and whatever thin thread of gratitude had begun to form in her chest, his next words cut it clean through. "As for you," he said, and his voice, if anything, grew colder, "stop trembling. It is tiresome. You people come here from your failing packs. You break what you touch. You weep and shake, and expect the world to pity you. The world does not. If you cannot carry a tray, you are of no use to this house, and if you are of no use to this house, you are of no use at all." He turned away, already finished with her, already reading his papers again as he walked. "Clean this up," he said to no one in particular, and was gone. Grace knelt among the broken crystal and picked up the pieces with numb fingers, and she did not understand why his words hurt so much worse than Mrs. Hale's hand would have. She had been called worthless before. She had been called useless, clumsy, nothing, 100 times, by 100 mouths, and she had endured it all behind her wall of stillness. But something about the way he had said it, without anger, without cruelty even, just stating it like a fact of the world, like weather, "You are of no use at all," had slipped past every defense she had, and gone straight into the locked room in her chest. She finished her duties that day, with her hands moving, and her mind far away. She ate nothing, she spoke to no one, and that night, instead of climbing into her bunk, she took the servant's stair, up and up and up, to the small stone balcony outside the linen store, where the maids hung washing in summer, because the walls of the palace were pressing in on her, and she could not breathe. The night was clear and enormous. A full moon hung over the northern hills, so bright it cast shadows, and Grace gripped the cold stone rail and looked out at a world that had never once been kind to her, and felt 12 years of pressure rise against the dam. Her mother's face, going gray in the lamplight. The burial no one attended. The birthdays no one remembered. The pack that had sold her without a goodbye. The room of whispers, the raised hand, and a cold voice in a cold gallery saying, "You are of no use at all," saying it the way you say the sky is dark, because to him, to all of them, it was simply true. "Do not cry," her mother whispered, 12 years away. "I know," Grace whispered back. "I know. I never do." But the dam had been holding for 12 years, and every dam has a night when the water wins. She felt it happen. She felt the crack run through her, quiet and final, and one single tear, just one, spilled over her lashes and slid down her cheek. Grace caught it with her fingertip, horrified, half expecting the world to split open. Nothing happened. The moon shone, the wind blew. It is only a tear, she thought, dizzy with a strange, guilty relief. It was only ever a tear. "Mother, you were sick, and you were frightened, and it was never true." She flicked the tear from her fingertip over the balcony rail, out into the night air, and turned to go back inside. She never saw where it landed. Below the balcony, in the private garden that no servant was permitted to enter, a man stood alone in the dark, as he did every night when sleep refused him. His face tipped up toward the moon that gave his people their name. The tear fell 40 feet through the moonlight, a single drop of silver, and landed on the back of King Adrian's bare hand. He felt it, a tiny cold touch, and glanced down, assuming it was rain. And then the drop began to shine. It sank into his skin like water into sand, and where it vanished, a thread of blackness rose in its place, spreading up the veins of his hand, like ink dropped into clear water. And the king of every wolf on the continent had one heartbeat to stare at it in disbelief before the pain arrived. It arrived like nothing he had ever felt, and he had felt swords, and silver, and fire. It dropped him to his knees on the garden stones. It tore a sound out of him that no one in that palace had ever heard the king make, and windows lit up one by one across the great gray walls, and boots began to thunder in the corridors, and somewhere far above, a kitchen girl climbing down the servants' stair paused, hearing shouting, and felt, without any reason at all, a cold hand close slowly around her heart. By midnight, the palace physicians were running. By 1, the priests had been pulled from their beds. By morning, every wolf within the walls knew the impossible news, and by the next nightfall, the whole kingdom would whisper it. The Alpha King had been struck down in his own garden, under the full moon, by something no blade could reach and no medicine could touch. The Alpha King had been cursed. For 3 days, the palace was a house of fear. The king did not leave his chambers. The physicians went in gray-faced and came out grayer. Servants carried up basins of water and carried down cloths stained with something dark, and the guards at the royal doors stood with their hands on their swords, as if a curse were a thing that could be fought with steel. Grace heard everything in fragments, the way servants always do. The blackness had spread from his hand to his elbow, then to his shoulder. His fever burned so hot that wet cloths dried on his skin. He could not keep down food. On the second night, his heart had stopped for the space of 10 seconds, and the chief physician had wept openly in the corridor afterward, an old man who had served 3 kings, saying he had never seen anything like it, that it was not sickness, not poison, not anything belonging to the natural world. And on the 4th day, they brought the seer. Her name was Marin, and she was ancient, older than anyone knew, a small bent woman who lived in a tower on the palace's north side and read the will of the moon goddess in ways that made even brave men uneasy. Grace saw her pass through the great hall, leaning on a white staff, her blind eyes wrapped in gray cloth, and every servant in the hall pressed back against the walls to let her by. Marin walked straight to the stairs without a guide, as if she could see perfectly well, and climbed toward the king's chambers, and the palace held its breath. She was inside for 1 hour. When she came out, she spoke quietly to the captain of the guard, and the captain's face changed, and within the hour the soldiers began moving through the palace, floor by floor, room by room, gathering every servant, every guard, every noble guest, every last soul within the walls, and marching them toward the great hall. No one was told why. No one dared to ask. Grace stood in the assembled crowd with the other kitchen girls, hundreds of people packed shoulder to shoulder in fearful silence, and watched old Marin climb slowly onto the dais at the front of the hall. The seer stood there for a long moment, her rapt eyes drifting across the crowd as if she were listening to it rather than looking at it. "The king has not been poisoned," she said at last. Her voice was thin, but it carried to every corner. He has not been struck by illness, nor by any weapon of man. What burns in his blood is older than this palace, older than the crown. It is a judgment, and it entered him through a single drop. She paused. A tear, one tear, fallen from the eyes of someone standing among you now. A murmur went through the hall like wind through wheat. Grace stopped breathing. No, she thought. No, no, it is not possible. It was nothing. It was one tear in the dark. It fell into a garden. It fell on stones. It fell on nothing. The person who shed it may not know what they carry, Maren continued, but the blood knows, and the blood answers me. She raised her white staff, and the crystal set into its head began to glow with a soft silver light, and she stepped down from the dais and began to walk into the crowd. What followed was the longest hour of Grace's life. The seer moved through the packed hall, row by row, the staff's light held before her, and everywhere she passed, the crystal stayed cool and pale, and people sagged with relief behind her, like grass springing back after a foot lifts. Grace stood in her row with her hands folded and her heart trying to beat its way out of her body, telling herself with every step the old woman took, "It will not glow for me. It was only a tear. My mother was sick and frightened, and it was only ever a tear." Maren turned into Grace's row. The crystal began to brighten while she was still 10 feet away. Grace watched it happen with a strange, floating unreality. The silver light swelling, the old woman's steps slowing, the rapt face turning toward her, and the people on either side of her shrinking away as the staff's glow grew so bright it threw shadows, until Grace stood alone in a circle of empty floor and silver light, and the whole great hall of the royal palace stared at her, and the seer stopped before her and said, quietly, almost gently, "There you are." The hall erupted. "Witch," someone shouted, and then a dozen voices, then 100. "Witch, curse-bearer, she has killed the king," and hands were seizing Grace's arms, guards, their grips like iron, and Mrs. Hale's voice cut through everything, shrill with triumph. "I knew it. I knew there was something wrong with that creature from the first day." Grace did not fight. She could not have fought if she had wanted to. The world had gone thin and far away, and the only thing that felt real was a voice 12 years old whispering, "If they ever fall on the wrong person, the world will change, and it will not change kindly." Mother, Grace thought, as they dragged her from the hall. "You knew. You always knew." They put her in the deepest cell of the palace dungeons, stone on every side, a door of black iron, and they left her there, while, far above, the council of nobles gathered around the dying king's bed and decided her fate. It did not take them long. She learned the verdict from the guard who brought her water at dawn, a young man who would not meet her eyes. "Sorcery against the crown," he said quietly. "The sentence is death. It will be carried out at sunset." Grace sat against the cold wall of her cell and waited to feel something. Terror, or grief, or fury at the unfairness of it. One tear, one single tear in 18 years, and it would cost her life. But the locked room in her chest had taken this too, the way it had taken everything, and all she felt was tired. She held her mother's sealed locket in both hands, and pressed it to her lips, and whispered, "I kept the promise for 12 years. I am sorry it was not enough." Sunset came. The guards came with it. They led her up from the dungeons and out into a small stone courtyard, where a post stood ready, and a row of archers waited, because for crimes of sorcery, the old law demanded arrows of silver. A priest read the charges. The captain asked if she had final words. Grace looked at the sky, which was turning gold and red over the walls, the most beautiful sky she had ever seen, and said nothing at all, because there was no one in the world to say it to. The archers raised their bows, and in the highest tower of the palace, King Adrian began to die. It happened between one heartbeat and the next. The physicians would swear to it afterward, trembling as they told it. The king had been stable for an hour, as stable as his ruined body could be, and then, at the very moment the sun touched the walls, he arched off the bed with a sound that cracked the air, and the blackness in his veins surged like floodwater, leaping up his throat, spreading beneath the skin of his face, and his heart began to slam and stumble and fail. The chief physician screamed for the priests screamed for Maren, and Maren, standing at the window with her rapt eyes turned toward the execution yard far below, said only one word: "Stop." They did not understand. She struck her staff on the floor with a crack like breaking ice, and turned on the room full of dying king and helpless men, and her thin voice filled every corner. Stop the execution. Now. Run, you fools. Every step she takes toward death he takes with her. Their lives are bound. Kill the girl and you kill the king within the hour. Afterward, the captain of the guard would remember that run for the rest of his life. Down 11 flights of stairs with the seer's words in his ears, bursting into the courtyard, screaming the order with the archers' fingers already tightening on their strings. The bows came down, the arrows went unloosed by the width of a single breath, and Grace, standing against the post with her eyes on the burning sky, watched the men who had come to kill her stumble to a halt, and could not understand, at first, why she was still alive. They brought her up through the palace at a run, this girl in chains who 1 hour ago had been condemned as the king's murderer, and they brought her into the royal chambers where no servant had ever set foot, and the moment she crossed the threshold, 2 things happened at once. The king's thrashing stilled, and the blackness in his veins, visibly, before a dozen witnesses, retreated 1 inch. The room went absolutely silent. The physicians stared. The priests stared. Maren stood by the great bed, leaning on her staff, and nodded slowly, as if hearing the last note of a song she had known all along. Closer, she said to the guards, and they pushed Grace forward, step by step, and with every step the king's breathing eased, the fever glow faded from his skin, the black threads sank back down his throat, down his shoulder, until, when Grace stood at last beside the bed, close enough to touch him, the man who had been minutes from death lay quiet, breathing slowly, like a storm that had blown itself out. Grace looked down at the king, at the frost-gray eyes that fluttered open and found her face, and widened, first in confusion, then in recognition, and then in something that was neither, something raw and furious and afraid. You, he whispered. It is her tear that burns in you, Maren said into the silence, and her voice was not unkind, but it was without mercy, the way truth is, and it is her presence that holds the burning back. This is the shape of it, my king, and no power under the moon will change it. Send her a mile away, and you will not see morning. Keep her near, and you live. She is your curse. She said the next words slowly, so that everyone in that room, the king most of all, would carry them out into the whispering palace. And she is your cure, the same girl, the same blood. You cannot have one without the other. The silence stretched. Grace stood in her chains beside the royal bed, 18 years old, an orphan with a sealed locket and a locked heart, and watched the most powerful man in the world stare up at her with helpless fury, a king in a cage no one could see, and she understood, with a cold, clear certainty, that her old life had ended twice in 1 week. Once when the crystal glowed, and now, forever, in this room. The king turned his face away from her, toward the wall. When he spoke, his voice was a ruin of what it had been, but the ice in it had survived. Unchain her, he said. Put her in the antechamber. She does not leave this floor. He closed his eyes, and his jaw tightened as if the next words cost him more than the curse did. And get out. All of you. Get out. They took the chains from Grace's wrists and led her to a small room adjoining the king's chamber, and the door closed, and she sat down on the narrow bed in the dark, 1 wall away from the man her tear had nearly killed, the man her breathing body was now keeping alive, and she almost laughed at the terrible strangeness of it, and she did not cry, because now, more than ever before in her entire tearless life, she could not afford to. The new shape of Grace's life was a floor of the palace, and a man who hated her. The rules came down on the first morning, delivered by the captain of the guard in a flat voice, while Grace stood in the antechamber with her hands folded. She would remain within the royal wing at all times. She would take her meals there. She would sleep in the antechamber. When the king's pain worsened, and it worsened every day at dusk, like a tide, she would sit in the chair by his window until it passed. She would not speak to him unless he spoke first. She would not touch him. She would not look at him longer than necessary. She was, the captain finished, reading from a paper without meeting her eyes, to think of herself as medicine, present when required, unnoticed otherwise. Medicine. Grace turned the word over that night in her narrow bed. She had been called worse things. At least medicine was useful, and she had spent her whole life being told she was not. The king made the arrangement as cold as he could. In the first week he did not speak 1 word to her. When she came to sit by his window at dusk, he turned his back and worked at his desk as if the chair were empty. though she could see the black threads in his wrist fade as the minutes passed, could hear his breathing loosen, could watch the pain leave him because she existed, and receive not even a glance in payment. When his counsel came, she was sent to the antechamber like a dog. When physicians examined him, they spoke of her in the third person while she stood in the room. The girl seems to be most effective within 30 feet. The girl should be kept nearer during the night hours. The girl, the girl, the girl. She bore it the way she had borne everything. But she watched. There was nothing else to do in that gilded cage but watch. And Grace had spent 18 years learning to see what people did not wish to show. And what she saw, slowly, day by day, was that the coldest man in the world was not cold at all. He was burning, and had simply learned to burn without light. She saw that he did not sleep, not could not, because of the curse, but would not, and had not for years, long before her tear ever fell. He worked until the candles died, and then sat in the dark by the window, and some nights she heard him, through the wall, cry out in his sleep when exhaustion finally took him. Short broken sounds, and always words in them, the same words, no, and please, and once, terribly, a child's word, mother. In the mornings his face would be gray and locked, and he would be crueler than usual, and Grace learned that his cruelty rose and fell with his nightmares, like smoke above a fire. She saw that no one touched him, ever, not a hand on the shoulder, not a brush of fingers passing a cup. The whole palace obeyed the rule, never touch the king, and Grace began to wonder whether the rule had been made to protect his dignity, or to protect something else, because once, when the old chief physician reached toward his wounded shoulder without warning, the king flinched. The alpha king of the continent, who had faced down 4 rebellions, flinched from an old man's hand, like a boy who had learned young, that hands mean harm. He covered it in half a second with ice and orders, but Grace saw. She knew that flinch. She had one of her own. And he saw her too. That was the strange thing, the thing she never expected. He pretended she was furniture, but a man does not memorize furniture, and by the second week Grace realized he had memorized her. When Mrs. Hale, still head of the household and twice as poisonous now, sent up Grace's meals late and cold and half the proper size, it was the king who noticed, glancing once at her tray, saying nothing, and the next day the meals came hot and generous and on time, and Mrs. Hale looked as if she had swallowed a wasp. When the dusk pain came early one evening, and Grace ran the length of the wing to reach his rooms, arriving breathless, he stared at her flushed face for a long moment, and then had a cot moved into the window alcove, so she would never have to run again. He did these things without a word, disguised as orders about household efficiency, and if she thanked him, his face would shut like a door. She stopped thanking him. She just watched him grow a fraction less gray each dusk when she entered, and understood that her presence eased something in him beyond the curse, and that he would rather die than admit it. One evening in the 3rd week, he spoke to her. She was in her chair by the window, he was at his desk, and had been reading the same page for an hour. Outside, snow had begun to fall on the northern hills, the first of the season. Without looking up, in a voice like someone forcing a rusted gate, the king said, "The pack you came from, Black Moon, were they good to you?" Grace was so startled that she answered honestly. "No," she said. He nodded slowly, still not looking at her, as if she had confirmed something. "Your parents?" "Dead," Grace said. "My mother when I was 6. I never knew my father." The snow fell. The fire cracked. The king turned his unread page, and then he said, quietly, almost to the window, "My mother died when I was 9. This palace was not good to me either." It was the first true thing he had ever told her, and it seemed to shock him more than her, because he stood abruptly, said, "You may go early tonight," and did not speak to her again for 3 days. But something had shifted, the way a frozen river shifts under the ice before anyone can see the water move. He began, gradually, to allow her small, strange freedoms. Books, first. He noticed her looking at his shelves, and said, with maximum coldness, "Take one if you must. They are not decorations." And when he discovered, from her embarrassment, that she could read only a little, he was silent for a long time. And the next morning a tutor appeared, an elderly scholar sworn to secrecy, and Grace, who had scrubbed floors while other children learned letters, sat in the royal wing of the palace, learning to read properly at 18, and the king pretended to have nothing to do with it, and paid for all of it. Then the garden. She had not felt wind on her face in a month, And one dusk she said so, not complaining, just saying it, watching the snow. The next evening the captain of the guard escorted her, bewildered, to the king's private garden, the one no servant could enter, the one where her tear had fallen, and told her she could walk there 1 hour each day. She walked in the snow among the sleeping rosebeds, and looked up once at the high balcony where her whole life had turned, and when she glanced at the king's window, he was watching her, and did not look away in time. The court noticed. Of course they noticed. Palaces are made of eyes. The whispers move through the corridors like drafts. The curse girl walks in the king's garden. The curse girl has a tutor. The king asked twice whether the curse girl's chamber was warm enough. Most of the whispers were merely scandalized, but some were colder, and more careful, and they gathered, as cold and careful things do, around one man. Lord Victor was the late king's younger brother, Adrian's uncle, a silver-haired man, with a warm smile and beautiful manners, beloved by half the council, and first in line for the throne, should the young king die without an heir. He visited his nephew's sick room every few days, full of concern, pressing the physicians for hopeful news, and Grace, watching from her corner as she watched everything, noticed what no one else seemed to notice, that Lord Victor's warm eyes counted the black threads on the king's wrist, every visit, the way a merchant counts money, and that on the days the king looked stronger, his uncle's smile took 1 extra second to arrive. She said nothing. Who would listen to the curse girl? But she began to watch Lord Victor the way she had once watched Mrs. Hale's hands. The night everything changed came at the end of the first month, and it began with a sound Grace had learned in 18 years of sleeping in dangerous places, the sound of a footstep, trying not to be one. It was past midnight. She was awake in the window alcove of the king's chamber, where she now slept during his worst stretches, and the king was finally, mercifully asleep, and the footstep came from the servant's door in the paneling, the little hidden door used for coal and linens, which was always locked, and which now opened without a sound, because someone on the inside of the palace had oiled it and unlocked it, and 3 men came through it with knives in their hands. They were dressed as palace guards. They moved like men who had been given a map, and they went straight for the bed of the weakened, sleeping king. Grace did not decide what she did next. There was no moment of choice she could ever remember afterward, no weighing of her small life against his. There was only her body, moving, before her mind had finished understanding, up from the alcove and across the room, and she did the only thing a kitchen girl could do against armed men. She screamed. One enormous scream that split the sleeping palace, and threw herself between the knives and the bed. Pain tore across her shoulder, white and shocking. She heard the king come awake with a roar, heard the chamber doors burst inward, heard chaos, shouting, the clash of guards, one assassin down, one taken, one gone back through the little door into the dark. And then the noise faded strangely, as if someone were turning the world's volume down, and the floor tilted up to meet her. And the last thing Grace knew was being caught, before she struck the stone. Caught and held hard against a chest whose heart was slamming, and a voice she had only ever heard, cold, cracking down the middle, as it shouted her name, her actual name, not the girl, not the curse girl, her name. Grace. Grace. Look at me. And the strange, dizzy thought followed her down into the black. He knows my name. He has known it all along. Grace woke to sunlight and the wrongness of comfort. She was lying in a wide, soft bed in a room she did not know, her shoulder bound in clean bandages, and the wrongness was everywhere. The sheets were too fine. The fire was too warm. There were winter roses in a vase by the window, actual roses, in the north, in the snow, which meant someone had ordered the glasshouse opened, and no one opened the royal glasshouse for a servant. She lay still, cataloging the aches of her body, and slowly became aware that she was not alone. A chair had been drawn up beside the bed. In the chair, asleep sitting upright with his arms crossed, as if even unconsciousness were a thing he refused to fully surrender to, was the king. Grace stared at him. She had never seen him asleep up close, never seen his face without its armor, and it was like looking at a different man, younger. The cold smoothed away, a faint line between his brows, as if even his dreams required vigilance. She wondered how long he had been there. She wondered, with a small internal shock, whether he had been there the whole time. He woke the way soldiers wake, instantly and completely, and caught her looking at him. For a moment neither of them moved. Then his face began the familiar journey back behind its walls, and stopped halfway, and could not seem to finish, and what remained was something Grace had no name for. "You have been asleep for 2 days," he said. "The physicians say the wound is clean. It will scar." He looked at her bandaged shoulder and then away, at the window, at the roses, and his jaw worked, and finally the words came out of him, as if each one were being pulled against its will. "That knife was meant for my heart. You had no armor, no weapon, and no reason on this earth to love me, and you stepped in front of it." He turned back to her, and his eyes were terrible, not cold now but the opposite, too much feeling, where for years there had been none. Why? Grace considered the question honestly, because he deserved honesty, and the honest answer frightened her. "I do not know," she said. "There was no time to think. There was only," she hesitated, "only that I could not watch you die." Something moved through his face like wind over water. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, stood with his back to her, and Grace watched his shoulders rise and fall 3 times before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had changed, quieter, stripped. "When they told me about you, after the seer found you," he said, "I asked for everything. Where you came from, who your people were. I wanted to know my enemy." He gave a short breath that was almost a laugh, without any joy in it. 18 years in that pack, and the record of you would not fill half a page. No family, no property, no complaints filed, though the marks on your hands say there should have been many. He turned around. "Every person in your life has failed you, Grace. And I stood in that gallery a month ago and told you that you were of no use at all, and 2 nights ago you took a knife that was meant for me." He said it flatly, laying the facts side by side like evidence in a trial where he was the accused. "I have been many things I am not proud of. I have never before been ashamed." Grace did not know what to say to a king's shame, so she said nothing, and the silence that followed was, strangely, the least lonely silence of her life. The palace, meanwhile, had gone to war with itself over the failed attack. 1 assassin dead, 1 escaped, and 1 taken alive, and the 1 taken alive had died in his cell before dawn on the first night, poisoned, before he could be questioned, which told the captain of the guard everything and proved nothing. The little servant's door had been unlocked from inside. The 3 men had worn real palace uniforms and carried a real map of the royal wing. Someone with rank, someone with access, someone inside the walls had opened the way, and the palace crawled with suspicion, and Lord Victor was magnificent, demanding investigations, doubling the guard, sitting at his nephew's side with his warm eyes full of fury at the traitors. And Grace watched him from her pillow and thought, "You counted the black threads again when you came in. You did it before you even said good morning." It was the chief physician, in the end, who pulled the thread that unraveled the world, and he did it by accident, trying to save her life. Grace's wound, though clean, had bled a great deal, and on the 2nd day, her strength was slow in returning, and the old physician, taking no chances with the only medicine keeping his king alive, ordered a full examination, her blood studied in the manner of the old healers, under crystal, by moonlight. He performed the examination himself, at night, in his tower workroom, and an hour before dawn, the king, sleepless as always, was summoned by a shaking apprentice, and climbed to the tower, and found the old man sitting motionless before his instruments, with tears running openly down his face. "Tell me," the king said. The physician tried twice before the words came. "Your Majesty, I took my oath 50 years ago, under your grandfather. There were things we were commanded then never to speak of, records we were commanded to burn. I burned them, but I read them first, and I am old, and I have forgotten nothing. God help me." He looked up. "The girl's blood shines, my king. Under the moon crystal, it shines silver, like light through water. There is only one bloodline in all the histories whose blood carries the moon's own light." He said the next word, the way men say the names of the dead, Lunaris. The king went very still. Everyone knew the name, the way everyone knows a scar. The Lunaris had been an order of moon priestesses, healers and seers, keepers of the oldest bond between wolves and the goddess, and they had lived in a white temple village in the Western Valley, and 20 years ago, in the last years of the old king's reign, sickness had swept that valley, or so the official histories said, and the Lunaris were gone, all of them, mourned in one breath and forgotten in the next, the way the crown wished. The physician was still speaking, half to himself now. Her mother must have survived it. hidden herself in some far pack, hidden the child, taught her to bury what she carried. The tears of a Lunaris priestess were said to be the strongest thing under the moon, the goddess's own judgment made into water, blessing to the worthy, fire to the guilty. He raised his wet eyes to his king. Sire, why would the goddess's judgment burn you? But the king was no longer listening. The king was standing in the tower workroom, with 20 years of carefully buried nights rising through the floor, because the official histories said sickness. But Adrian had been 9 years old in the last years of his father's reign, and 9-year-old boys see things. And there was a reason the king of every wolf on the continent had not slept a full night in 2 decades. A reason he cried out no, and please, and mother. A reason the smell of smoke in any hearth in any room could still, without warning, close a cold hand around his throat. He walked down from the tower in silence. He crossed the sleeping palace. He entered the room where Grace lay recovering, and stood at the foot of her bed in the gray light before dawn, and she woke and saw his face, and sat up in alarm, wound and all, because she had seen the king cold, and seen him angry, and seen him ashamed, but she had never seen him afraid. "Your mother," he said, and his voice was a stranger's voice. "What do you remember of her? Before the pack, before you were 6. Anything, everything, almost nothing," Grace said slowly. "Warmth, singing." She sang in a language I never heard again. And she reached without thinking for the sealed locket at her throat. A white house. I dreamed of it for years. A white house, and bells, and then fire, and running in the dark, and her hand around my wrist. I thought they were only dreams. "A white temple," the king said, "in a green valley, with a bell tower." Grace stared at him. "I never told anyone about the bell tower," she whispered. "How do you know about the bell tower?" And the Alpha King, the most feared man in the world, sank down onto the edge of a servant girl's bed, as if his legs had stopped believing in him, and put his face in his hands, and told her. "Because I was there," he said. "I was 9 years old, and my father took me to the Western Valley, to watch him do what kings do to power they cannot own. The Lunaris would not swear their order to the crown. They answered only to the goddess. So he answered them. He said it was a lesson. He made me watch the lesson. His hands were shaking against his face. Every night for 20 years, I have watched it again. The white walls, the bells ringing the alarm, a woman running into the dark with a child in her arms, and my father's men turning to follow. And I?" He stopped, and the room was silent for a long time, and when he finally lifted his face it was gray as ash. I was 9. I could do almost nothing. I did one thing. When the men turned to follow the woman and child, I screamed that I had seen them run the other way, toward the river. I lied to my father's soldiers, and I never knew until this hour whether it mattered, whether they lived. Grace could not breathe. The room seemed to tilt around the fixed point of his ruined face, and 20 years collapsed into a single dark valley, a running woman, a small girl clutched against a pounding heart, and a boy's voice in the smoke behind them, crying out the wrong direction, buying them the dark. They lived, Grace heard herself say, from very far away. The woman carried the child east for a month, and bought a place in a pack called Black Moon, with the last thing she owned, and she never sang again, and she died when the child was 6, and the last thing she ever did was make her daughter promise never to cry. She looked down at her own hands, the hands of the last Lunaris, and then up at the son of the man who had destroyed her world, the boy who had saved her from it, the king her tear had judged. "It mattered," she whispered. "It was me. Adrian, it was me." For 3 days after the truth came out, Grace and the king moved around each other, like two people sharing a house with a ghost. It should have made things simpler. The mystery was solved. She knew now why her mother had feared her tears, and he knew now why the goddess's judgment had chosen his blood to burn. But truth is not a key that unlocks a door and lets everyone walk through smiling. Truth is a flood, and when the water goes down, you have to live in what it leaves behind. Grace would look at him across the room and see the boy in the smoke who had saved her life. Then she would blink and see the son of the man who had made the smoke, wearing that man's crown, sleeping in that man's palace, ruling from that man's throne, and her heart would twist in 2 directions at once, until she had to leave the room. And he watched her leave, every time, and never once tried to stop her, because he believed he deserved every step of her leaving. It was old Marin who broke the silence between them, in her way, which was sideways and without mercy. The seer summoned Grace to her tower on the fourth day, the first time anyone had summoned Grace anywhere since the world changed. The tower room smelled of dried herbs and candle smoke, and the old woman sat by a small fire, her rapt eyes turned toward the door before Grace had even knocked. "Sit, child," she said. "You are angry, and you do not know at whom, and it is making your shoulders ache. Sit." Grace sat. "I am not angry," she said, and the old woman laughed softly, a sound like paper. "You are the last daughter of the Lunaris," Marin said. "I knew your grandmother. I was a young seer when your temple was the brightest place in this kingdom, and I read the sky the night it burned, and I have waited 20 years to see what the goddess would do about it, because the goddess, child, is patient, and she wastes nothing, not even grief." She leaned forward. "So, you have learned what he was, a boy of 9, watching. Now I will tell you what he became, since he will never tell you himself, and you cannot judge a man by the one night he showed you." And she told her. She told her about the young prince who, at 19, had come to a throne still warm from his father's rule, and had spent his first year quietly dismantling everything his father built, dismissing the old king's cruelest commanders, emptying the debtors' cells, sending grain without banners or credit to the packs his father had starved. She told her about the 4 rebellions, and how the histories called them rebellions crushed by the Ice King, and how 3 of the 4 had been led by his father's old warlords, furious at the sun for softening the crown, and how the young king had ended each one with the fewest lives the age allowed, and had never once corrected the histories, letting the world call his mercy coldness, because fear kept the peace cheaper than love. And she told her one thing more, in a quieter voice. "In the 2nd year of his reign," she said, "a young king rode west with 6 men he trusted. No banners, no records. To a burned valley his father's clerks had erased from every map. And he found what remained there, under the ash and the wild grass, and he buried them, child. Every one he could find. With his own hands, over 11 days, and he set white stones over them in the manner of moon rites, which he had to learn in secret from an old blind woman in this tower, because moon rites had been forbidden by his father's law." She sat back. "He thinks I kept his secret all these years. I did. I am done now. The dead do not need secrets. The living need each other." Grace walked down from the tower with her whole understanding of the world rearranged, and she did not go to find him, not yet, because some things need a night to settle. But that evening at dusk, when the tide of his pain came in, and she took her chair by his window, she did not bring a book to hide behind, and when the worst of it had passed, and the black threads had sunk back down his wrist, she said, quietly, into the firelit silence, "I know about the valley. The white stones. Marin told me." The king went very still at his desk. Grace watched the back of his neck, the set of his shoulders, a man bracing. "You buried my grandmothers," she said, and her voice did not shake, though it wanted to. "You learned our rites in secret to do it." She stood, and crossed the room, and stopped beside his desk, closer than she had ever chosen to stand to him, and the last daughter of the Lunaris looked down at the son of their destroyer, and said the words that broke 20 years of ice off both their lives. "I do not forgive your father. I never will, and you have never asked me to. But you were never him, Adrian. You have spent your whole life making sure of it, and the only person who does not see that is you." He did not answer for a long time. When he finally looked up at her, his frost-gray eyes were bright, dangerously bright, and Grace realized, with a strange soft shock, that the man who could not be touched, and could not be moved, was one wrong word away from weeping in front of a kitchen girl, and that he would rather face the assassins again. So she did not say the wrong word, or any word. She simply, slowly, deliberately, breaking the first rule she had been given in this palace, laid her hand over his hand on the desk, and the king closed his eyes, and turned his hand over, and held on. Everything changed after that, and because it was a palace, everything changing meant everyone talking. The king no longer hid what she was to him. Grace was moved from the antechamber to proper rooms, with windows facing the winter garden. Her tutor came openly now, and a second tutor besides, for history and figures. Mrs. Hale, who had sent up one cold meal too many, was retired from the household with a pension, and a look from the king that aged her 5 years, and the servants of the royal wing, who had feared Mrs. Hale for decades, treated Grace afterward with a careful warmth that slowly stopped being careful. At dusk, when the pain tide came, the king and the curse girl now sat on the same side of the room, and some evenings, when the pain was light, they simply talked. About books she was discovering and he had read at 12, about the northern stars, about nothing, and more than once a passing guard heard, through the royal doors, a sound no one in that palace could remember hearing before. The king laughing, quietly, badly, like a man using a language he had forgotten. He was still dying, that was the cold stone under all of it, and they both carried it. The curse had not been lifted, only held at bay, and Marin, when pressed, would say only that. Judgment does not end until it is answered, and no one knew what answer the goddess wanted. Each week, the tide of dusk pain came in a little higher. Each week the black threads retreated a little more slowly. Grace kept him alive, but she was a wall against a rising sea, and everyone who loved him, which was a list that had recently doubled in length from one name to two, could count the months on their fingers. And everyone who did not love him could count them too. Lord Victor had spent 20 years being the most patient man in the kingdom. He had watched his brother rule, and then watched his nephew rule, and smiled through both reigns, and waited, because the crown had been one heartbeat away his whole life, and Victor believed in heartbeats, the way other men believed in gods. The curse had been his miracle. He had needed to do nothing at all, simply wait and grieve handsomely, and the throne would arrive like winter, inevitable. The girl had ruined that. First her presence had steadied the dying king. Now, worse, unbearably worse, the dying king had begun to look alive. There was color in his face at council. There was, goddess forbid, laughter behind his doors. And there were whispers, delicate, delicious, dangerous whispers, moving through the court, that the king had found more than medicine in the Lunaris girl. And everyone with eyes knew what a king in love did next. A king in love married. A king married made heirs. And an heir, even the possibility of an heir, moved Lord Victor from one heartbeat away to a lifetime away. The assassins had been a rushed mistake, and their failure had cost him 3 good men and a month of caution. Victor did not intend to make a second mistake. He had learned something from the first, something the whole palace had taught him without meaning to. You could not reach the king with knives while the girl stood guard. But you did not need to reach the king at all. You only needed to reach the girl. And so, in the last week of winter, in his beautiful apartments in the south wing, Lord Victor poured wine for a sharp-faced woman who had recently and bitterly retired from royal service, and for a gray little clerk who kept the council's records, and for a captain whose brother had died, leading the Third Rebellion, and he smiled his warm smile, and raised his glass, and said, gently, as if the words grieved him, "My friends, it is time someone spoke honestly about what that creature has done to our king." Spring came to the north the way everything came to the north, late and fighting for every inch. The snow pulled back from the garden paths. The glasshouse roses were carried out into true sunlight. And on the first warm evening of the year, the king asked Grace to walk with him in the garden, and she knew from his voice that this was not an ordinary asking. They walked between the waking rosebeds in the long gold light, and for once, he did not talk about council matters or her lessons, and the silence between them grew warm and heavy, like the hour before summer rain. At the far wall of the garden there was a stone bench beneath a very old moon-apple tree, the only one in the palace grounds, and they sat, and the king looked at his own hands for a while, the black threads faint in the evening light, and then he said, "I need to tell you what these months have been. Because I am running out of them, and I find I am more afraid of leaving it unsaid than I am of saying it." Grace's heart began to pound. "Adrian," she said, but he shook his head, gently. "Let me." "I was 9 when I learned what my family was," he said. "I decided that night that the safest thing I could be was nothing. Feel nothing, need nothing, touch nothing, and then nothing I loved could ever be used, and nothing I did could ever become my father. I built a whole kingdom of nothing, and I ruled it for 20 years, and I called it peace." He turned and looked at her, and the evening light was in his eyes, and nothing about them was frozen anymore. "And then a kitchen girl wept one tear onto the wrong hand," he said, "and I have felt more in these few months. More pain, yes, but more of everything, more than in the whole rest of my life together. You were sent to judge me, Grace. I know that. I have made my peace with the burning, but the goddess, in her strange mercy, sent my judgment to me with your face and your patience and your unbearable courage, and I could not help it. His voice caught and steadied. I love you. I have loved you since you stood in that gallery, with broken glass around your feet, and refused to weep for people who did not deserve your tears. I do not ask you to answer. I have no right to ask a Lunaris for anything. I only needed you to know it while I am still here to say it. The garden was utterly silent. Grace sat under the moon apple tree with her heart so full it hurt. 18 years of nobody's girl, and the king of the world had just laid his broken heart in her lap like a boy. She reached up and touched his face, and he closed his eyes at her touch, the way parched ground takes rain. And she leaned toward him, and he toward her, slowly. The first kiss of both their strange, lonely lives, arriving like something fated, inches away, a breath away. Running footsteps on the gravel. A guard, white-faced, skidding to a halt and dropping to one knee. Your Majesty, forgive me. Forgive me. You are needed. Lord Edwin has collapsed at the evening meal. There is. The guard swallowed. There is blackness in his veins, sire. Like yours. And half the court saw it happen after the girl passed his table this afternoon. The moment shattered like the crystal in the gallery, and the pieces flew everywhere. And afterward, looking back, Grace would understand that everything that followed had been aimed at exactly that moment, timed to it. That somewhere in the palace, Lord Victor had chosen the first warm evening of spring, precisely because his spies had told him the king's heart was ripening, and that the whole trap had been sprung to catch it green. Lord Edwin was a fat, harmless, popular old noble, and by the time Grace and the king reached the hall, he was laid out on a long table with his sleeve cut open, and dark lines crawled up his forearm for all the court to see, and he was moaning that he burned, and the court was one packed circle of horrified faces, and every face turned when Grace entered, and none of them were kind. She had walked past his table that afternoon, on her way from her history lesson. 30 witnesses had seen it. Nobody had seen anything else, because there had been nothing else to see. But fear does not need much, and by nightfall the story had grown teeth. The witch had tired of the king, and chosen a new victim. The witch could curse with a look now. The witch was picking off the nobility one by one, and who among them was safe? It was masterfully done. Grace knew it was false, and the king knew, and old Marin, summoned to examine Lord Edwin, hobbled around him once, and straightened up with her rapt eyes turned toward the watching court, and said flatly that this was paint and pepper oil and theater, that there was no more curse in Lord Edwin than there was sense, and for a moment the trap wobbled. But Victor had built it too well. That same night, a search, demanded by the council for everyone's safety, found in Grace's rooms a black candle, a book of forbidden marks, and a lock of the king's dark hair bound with red thread, hidden behind the loose stone that Grace had never known was loose, planted by hands that had keys to everything. And the sharp-faced woman who had once run the royal household swore before the full council that she had always seen the girl gathering strange herbs and whispering over the king's food, and the gray little clerk produced records of every hour the girl had spent unsupervised, and the captain, whose brother had died in the Third Rebellion, demanded to know how long the crown intended to gamble the safety of the realm on the word of a blind old woman and a besotted king. Besotted, there it was, spoken aloud in full council, the true weapon, and Grace, standing accused at the center of the great chamber, watched it strike home. Because the king rose from his throne in fury to defend her, and the council watched him do it, and she saw the whole room see exactly what Victor wanted them to see. Not a king weighing evidence, but a bewitched man protecting his witch. And every word Adrian said in her defense drove the accusation deeper. She is the only reason I am alive, he said. And the council heard. She controls whether he lives. She has saved my life twice, he said. And the council heard. She has made herself indispensable, which is what a clever poisoner does. Lord Victor did not lead the attack. That was the terrible elegance of him. He sat in sorrowful silence while smaller men did the shouting, and only at the end, when the council had worked itself into voting fear, did he rise, silver and reasonable, and grieve his way to the killing stroke. No one honors what this girl has done for my nephew more than I, he said gently, and no one denies the bond that keeps him breathing, nor would any of us harm her while that bond holds his life. But a curse that spreads is a plague, and a plague admits no exceptions, even beloved ones. I propose no execution. His warm eyes found Grace across the chamber, and for one flicker, one heartbeat, she saw all the way down to the cold machinery inside the man, and he let her see it, because who would believe her? "I propose only that the girl be confined," he said. "Sealed and warded in the North Tower, guarded by the priesthood, close enough that the king's health is preserved. Merely kept," he smiled sadly, "where her tears can fall on no one else, until the crown can prove her innocence, however long that takes. A stone room for the rest of her life, dressed as mercy." The council murmured its relief at so moderate a path, and every eye in the chamber turned to the king, because such an order touching the royal household required the king's own word, and Grace looked at Adrian across that terrible room, and watched the trap close on him exactly as it had been built to. If he refused the council outright, on no evidence but his heart, in the season when he needed their armies levied, and their taxes granted, and their loyalty against the plots he could smell but not yet prove, he handed Victor the last argument he needed. The king is no longer fit, and lost the crown, and with the crown every protection she had. If he agreed, he lost her. She watched him understand it. She watched the man who had faced 4 rebellions without blinking stand before a room of small, frightened men, holding her whole life, and, for 2 endless seconds, 3, 4, hesitate. He was going to find a third way. She would learn that later, much too late, that he had opened his mouth in that 5th second to reject the proposal, and summon the palace guard to arrest his uncle on suspicion alone, and gamble the whole kingdom on her, recklessly, absolutely, the way she had once thrown herself in front of knives. But Grace had lived 18 years being taught exactly how long people hesitated before choosing something else over her, and 4 seconds was longer than anyone had ever needed, and something in her, some ancient tired thing, quietly broke. She did not wait for the 5th second. She bowed her head to the council, said, clearly, "I will go to the tower tonight," turned, and walked out of the chamber, with her spine straight and her eyes dry, and did not once look back at the king, which was how she missed seeing him surge down from the throne after her, and being caught, and held, by the gentle, sorrowful, iron hands of his uncle. They came for her at midnight to take her to the tower, and one of the guards who came was the young man who, months ago in the dungeons, had brought her water and could not meet her eyes. His name was Peter, and this time he met her eyes, and what she saw in them was not a jailer. He waited until the corridor emptied, then he spoke fast and low. "Miss, listen to me. My cousin serves in Lord Victor's household, and there are men there who arrived last week who are not servants, and there is talk you are not meant to reach that tower at all. An accident on the stairs, a grief the whole court will pity. Once you are sealed away from witnesses, you belong to him, and the king will be told a story." His jaw was tight. "I took an oath to the crown, not to the crown's uncle. There is a supply gate on the riverside, and a boatman who owes me his son's life, and a moon with clouds on it, and it is tonight or it is never." Grace stood in the cold corridor, with her whole life balanced on a stranger's whisper, and thought of Adrian. 4 seconds of silence in a chamber full of enemies, and thought, if I stay I become the knife they hold to his throat forever, and if they end me quietly, he dies within the hour, and Victor has the throne by morning. Leaving is not leaving him. Leaving is the only shield I have left to give. She went. The escape was a blur she would remember all her life in single pictures. Peter's lantern going dark, the smell of the river gate, cold iron and wet stone. The boat, black on black water, and the boatman's silent nod, and the palace sliding away behind her, one lit window high in the royal wing, and her own hand pressed against her mouth to keep everything in it from coming out. She had 30 silver pieces from Peter's own pay, her spare dress, her mother's sealed locket, and a stolen cloak. And by dawn, she was farther from Adrian than she had been since the night her tear fell, and that was when she learned what the bond truly was. It was not distance that hurt, it was him. She could feel him, a thread behind her heart, pulled thinner with every mile, and through the thread came echoes, not thoughts, not words, but weather, and the weather in him was terrible. She felt the moment he learned she was gone, a lightning strike of it, doubling her over in the bottom of the boat. She felt the search parties go out, felt his fury burn for a day and a night. And then, on the 3rd day, she felt the fury stop, and something far worse settle in its place. A still, gray, sinking quiet, like a house with its fires going out one by one. And Grace, hiding in the loft of a river mill 50 miles south, pressed both hands over her heart, and understood. The tide of his pain was coming in, and there was no wall against it now, and he had stopped fighting. She learned the rest in scraps of news at village wells, weeks old and twisted, but the shape came through. The king was gravely ill again. The king had called off the search for the escaped witch, forbidden it, on his own command, threatened to strip the rank of any officer who pursued her. The king's uncle, goddess bless his devotion, had stepped in to shoulder the burden of rule as regent, while his majesty fought for strength, and taxes were rising, and the border packs were being pressed for men, and old names from the days of the last king were appearing again, in the halls of power, and everything her tear had once judged was flowing quietly back into the world under Victor's warm smile, and the man she loved was letting his life gutter out in a tower, rather than have her dragged back to a cage. "If my life costs her freedom," a merchant's wife quoted at a well, saying it as gossip, romantic and distant, "then let me die." He said it before the whole council, they say. Fever talk, poor man. It was not fever talk. Grace felt the truth of it down the thinning thread every hour, and she stopped sleeping, and she walked south with no plan except away, and the goddess, who wastes nothing, walked her directly into the one place on earth she needed to be. She smelled it before she understood it, herbs and old smoke and something older, and she came over a green ridge at sunset and stopped as if she had walked into a wall. Below her lay a valley she had seen 1,000 times in dreams. The wild grass had taken most of it, and the bell tower was a broken white tooth against the evening, but she knew the shape of the walls, the way she knew her own hands, and scattered through the ruins, pale in the failing light, white stones stood over the quiet earth in careful rows, set there years ago by a young king's hands. Grace walked down into the valley of the Lunaris, her mother's valley, her valley, weeping absolutely nowhere except behind her own ribs, and a voice said from the ruined gateway, calm as if it had been waiting 20 years, "You took your time, granddaughter of the moon." The woman was old past guessing, blind, upright, dressed in undyed wool, and she was not Marin, though the two of them might have been sisters across a distance. She gave her name as Iris, keeper of the valley, last oath-holder of the order, too stubborn to die and too blind to matter, she said, which was why the soldiers had left her all those years ago, a broken old woman among the ashes. She had kept the rites alive alone. She had tended the white stones the strange young king had set, and she had read the sky the night, months ago, when a single tear of judgment fell 40 feet in the moonlight, and she had been waiting ever since. She fed Grace by a small fire in the ruined cloister, and made her tell all of it, every piece, and the old woman listened without moving, and at the end she was silent for a long time, and then she said, "You were taught your tears were a curse. That is a child's word for it, a frightened mother's word, and your mother had earned her fear, but it is not the truth. Sit still, and learn what you are. The tears of a Lunaris are the goddess's scales," she said. "They weigh what they touch. On the innocent, they heal, and there are stories of your grandmothers weeping over plague villages and leaving them singing. On guilt, they burn. But child, hear me. They do not burn to destroy. That is the part even our own order half forgot in the last soft years. Judgment was never punishment. Judgment is a door held open. The burning is every buried thing brought up to the light at once, every debt made real, and it consumes the guilty, only if the guilt is all there is. Your king carries his father's debt in his blood, and 20 years of his own turned away grief besides. Your tear called all of it due. That is what is burning him. Not evil, granddaughter. Unwept sorrow and unpaid history, and it will burn until the account is answered." "Then how is it answered?" Grace whispered. "Tell me how." The old woman turned her blind face toward the fire. "Two ways," she said. "Every judgment has 2 ways out. That is the law under the law. The first way is death. His life pays the whole account. His line ends. The debt closes. That is the way it is going now, and it is close. You feel it. I can hear that you feel it." She let that sit in the dark. "The second way is the one the order was made for, and it cannot be forced, planned, or pretended, which is why I cannot simply tell you to go and do it. The scales that judged him must choose to clear him. The same tears, the same eyes, willing and whole and true. Grief and mercy together, nothing held back. From a heart that knows everything he is and everything his blood has done, and forgives it anyway. Not because it is asked, not because it is owed, but because the heart overflows. Tears of judgment fell on him. "Child, Only tears of forgiveness can put out what they lit. Grace sat very still. 12 years, she said quietly. I have not truly wept in 12 years. I locked it, all of it. My whole life is in that locked room, and I do not know if I can open the door anymore. I have tried. The night I shed the tear that started this, one drop was all that came. One. And you are telling me the whole flood, willing, and if I cannot. Then he dies, the old woman said, without cruelty. Because the truth needs no help being cruel. And judgment passes to the throne he leaves. And I have read the sky, granddaughter, and the sky says the man who takes that throne will make the old king look gentle. And it was in that exact moment, in the ruined cloister, by the small fire, that Grace felt the thread behind her heart give a great sickening lurch, and go thin as spider silk. And far to the north, though she could not see it, torches were moving on the palace walls, and armed riders were pouring out of the gates, riding south, and they were not the king's men, because the king could no longer command anyone, and they carried Lord Victor's private seal, and their orders were very simple. The regent had learned from a broken young guard named Peter, who had held out with a courage that would be sung about later, everything about a river gate, and a boat, and where a Lunaris girl might run. Find her, the orders said. The king's life is now a matter of state, and the state requires the medicine returned. Alive, unharmed. And weeping was not mentioned in the orders at all, because Lord Victor had also been asking old women questions about the ways a judgment ends, and unlike Grace, he had known both answers for weeks, and he had no interest whatsoever in the second one. The riders reached the valley at dawn on the second day, and Grace did not run. She could have. Old Iris had woken her in the dark, hearing hoofbeats a blind woman should not have been able to hear, and there had been time, a ravine, a way up into the hills. Grace stood in the ruined gateway of her mother's temple, and watched the torches come down the ridge, and understood something with total clarity. Every road ran the same direction now. The thread behind her heart had grown so thin that some hours she lost it entirely, and stood gasping until it flickered back. Adrian was dying in days, perhaps hours. Whatever waited in the north, cage or trap or grave, it stood beside his bed, and there was nowhere else in the world she was going. Let Victor's men carry her. They would carry her to him faster than her feet could. So when the captain of the riders dismounted, expecting a hunt, he found a young woman standing calmly among white stones with her hands open, and an ancient blind woman beside her, and the old woman said something to the girl too quietly for any soldier to hear. She said, "Remember, granddaughter, willing, whole, and true, nothing held back. When the moment comes, and it will come terribly, do not fight the flood, be the flood." Then Grace was taken, courteously, coldly, and the valley fell behind her, and the last thing she saw of it was Iris, standing among the graves, with her blind face turned north, her lips moving, praying to the moon, in the language Grace's mother used to sing. They rode hard for 5 days, and every mile north, 2 rivers rose. The first was the thread. It thickened as the distance closed, and the weather flowing back down it was dreadful. Pain like a landscape, gray on gray on gray, and beneath the pain, something that frightened her more, a letting go, a slow settling, a man folding his life closed, like a finished letter. Hold on, she poured up the thread, not knowing if anything reached him. I am coming, you stubborn, frozen, impossible man. You waited 20 years for one warm thing. Do not dare leave before I get there. The second river was the news, and it flowed at every posting in and checkpoint, worse each day. The king no longer woke. The council had granted the regent emergency powers. Levies were marching. 2 border alphas who questioned the regent's seal had been arrested for treason. The palace was sealed to all visitors, all healers, all priests, and the old seer, Marin, had been confined to her tower for her own protection. And the words for his own protection, and for her own protection, were doing a great deal of work in the kingdom that spring. They brought Grace through the palace river gate at night, hooded, secret, and she understood why when she saw the corridors. The palace, she remembered, was gone. Victor's private men stood at every door, hard-eyed strangers wearing the royal colors like a costume, and the servants moved along the walls with their heads down, and the whole great building was silent, in a way it had not been silent even in the coldest days of the Ice King, because ice at least is still water, and this was stone. They took her, not to the royal wing, but down, to a clean bare room below the ground with a heavy door, and there, Lord Victor came to her, alone, warm as ever, and sat across a small table from her, and finally, with no counsel to perform for, and no court to charm, let her see the machinery all the way down. "You are a remarkable creature," he said pleasantly. "My nephew rules a continent, and I have never once seen him fight for anything, the way he broke himself refusing to hunt you. I confess, I did not plan on love. It nearly ruined everything. Love is unpredictable, and I have built my whole life on prediction." He folded his hands. "So let me tell you the future. Tonight my nephew's heart will finish failing. It is a matter of hours, his physicians tell me, the ones I chose. You will be in the room when it stops, because a rumor is already moving through the court that the witch escaped her escort and reached the king at the last, and when he dies with you beside him, the kingdom will have its story complete. The witch cursed him. The witch fled justice. The witch returned to finish her work. You will not survive the guard's grief, I am afraid. 2 problems, 1 night, and I inherit a throne wet with the court's tears, which is the only kind of tears," he smiled gently, "that will be shed in this palace tonight." He knew. That was his mistake, and mistakes of knowledge are the ones that ruin careful men. He knew about the second way out of judgment, and so he had built his whole final night around preventing tears of forgiveness, and it never once entered his elegant mind that he was about to escort into the king's chamber, with his own hands, the flood. Because here is what Lord Victor did not understand, had never understood, being a man who had felt nothing in 40 years but appetite. He thought the danger was a ritual, something planned, something staged, candles and rites, needing time and freedom he would not grant her. He did not know that the door of a locked room, held shut for 12 years against every grief a life could pour, does not open by ritual. It opens by breaking. And he was about to stand this girl beside the deathbed of the only person who had ever loved her, on purpose, as theater. They brought her up at midnight. The royal chamber was full of chosen witnesses, Victor's council allies, his tame physicians, guards at every wall, all assembled to watch the story end correctly. And the fire was low, and the great bed stood in shadow, and Grace walked toward it between armed men, and stopped breathing at what the months had done. Adrian lay still against the pillows, and the blackness had won. It webbed his throat, his jaw, the backs of his hands, thin dark rivers under skin gone gray as the palace stone, and his breath came so slow and so shallow that whole seconds died between each one. The thread between them, at this distance, this final distance, roared back to full life, and what came down it now was almost nothing at all. Embers, a banked fire in an abandoned house, and one faint thing more, one flicker that rose to meet her presence, the way his pain had once eased at her step, recognition. Even now, even from the far edge of himself, he knew she was there. "She is here as the law requires," Victor announced to the room, sorrow pitched perfectly, so that the bond may ease his majesty's passing, and the witnesses arranged their faces, and the physicians consulted their instruments, and Grace stood at the bedside, looking down at the ruin of the man who had buried her grandmothers with his own hands, and learned forbidden rites to do it right, who had lied to soldiers at 9 years old, and bought her the dark, who had hesitated 4 seconds once, and then spent every hour since paying for it, who had chosen to die rather than cage her, and she felt the locked room in her chest, the room with 12 years, and 18 years, and 2 lifetimes of grief, pressed inside it, shudder against its hinges. And then Adrian opened his eyes. No one expected it, least of all his physicians. The frost-gray eyes came open one last time, found her face without searching, as if he had known exactly where she would be standing, and the gray lips moved, and no sound came out. But Grace had spent her whole life reading what people could not say aloud, and she read it. "You came home," his lips said, and then, with the very last strength in the last hour of his life, the alpha king of every wolf on the continent did something he had never done for any power on earth. He turned his hand over on the blanket, palm up, open, asking. Grace took his hand in both of hers, and his fingers closed around hers with the grip of a man going over an edge, and hers closed back, and the hinges of the locked room tore away, and the door did not open, it burst. 12 years came out of her at once, and then all the rest. She wept for her mother, dying in a cold room with a warning instead of a lullaby. She wept for a 6-year-old at a burial no one attended, and for every birthday no one remembered, and for the girl of stone that a frightened child had built and then had to live inside. She wept for a 9-year-old boy in a burning valley, made to watch, screaming a merciful lie into the smoke, and for the man he became, 20 years alone in a kingdom of nothing, flinching from every hand. She wept for her grandmothers under the white stones, and for the young king on his knees in the ash for 11 days, learning their rights in secret to lay them down properly. And she found, at the bottom of all of it, exactly what old Iris had promised would have to be there. Not obligation, not ritual, not even mercy exactly, but overflow, a heart so full that the walls failed. And she bent over the dying king and held his hand to her cheek and forgave him, all of him, his blood, his father, his silence, his 4 seconds, everything, not because it was asked, and not because it was owed. And her tears fell on him freely, in front of every witness Victor had gathered to watch the opposite story. They struck his skin, and they blazed silver. The room lit up like moonrise indoors. The black webs beneath the king's skin caught the light and burned, not with darkness now but against it, silver flooding the dark rivers, driving them back down his throat, down his shoulder, down the wrist where one tear had entered on a winter night. And Adrian arched and drew a breath that went all the way down. The first whole breath in months, and the physicians were shouting, and the witnesses were on their feet, and somewhere behind them all, a chair went over, as Lord Victor rose, with his 40 years of prediction collapsing around him, and the goddess's judgment, called due by 1 tear, was answered in full by 10,000, and the account closed, and the king opened his eyes. What happened in the next 5 minutes would be told in that kingdom for 100 years, and every telling would get some detail wrong, and none of the tellings would need to exaggerate anything. The king sat up, a man whose heart had been hours from stopping, whose own physicians had signed the papers, sat up in the silver-lit chamber, with the last threads of blackness steaming off his skin, like frost off a window, and the room full of Victor's chosen witnesses saw the curse leave him with their own eyes, publicly, undeniably, before the story of the murdering witch could ever be told, and that was the first tower of Victor's plan to fall. The second fell when the king stood, because the curse, in leaving, took with it only what the tear had brought, and left behind everything the tear had found, and what it had found, underneath, was an alpha king in his prime, and what it had added, in the burning, was a man with nothing left in him, turned away or buried or ignored, and the difference was visible from across the room. The guards nearest the bed stepped back without meaning to. The chief false physician sat down slowly on the floor. Victor was already moving. Careful men keep one last plan in the marrow, and his was simple and old, the plan that had waited 40 years, and there was a blade in his hand that had been in his sleeve all evening, meant for grace in the confusion of the king's death, and if prediction had failed, then appetite would serve, and he crossed the chamber toward the girl whose tears had ruined everything, with the speed of a man half his age, and Grace saw him come, and could not move in time, and did not need to. Adrian came off the bed and put himself between them, and took his uncle's wrist out of the air, and the room heard the blade ring on the stone floor, and then the new-made king simply held him, one hand, no apparent effort, while Victor strained against a grip that might as well have been the palace itself, and the two of them stood eye to eye, the last of the old blood's poison, and the man it had failed to kill, and the whole chamber waited to watch the king do what his father would have done. He did not do it. That was the third tower, and the one the songs would make the most of. Adrian looked at his uncle for a long, quiet moment, and then he said, loudly enough for every witness, "You have spent your life waiting for me to become my father. One night, uncle. You needed me to be him for one night, and you could not get it, and you never will." Then he turned to the captain of the palace guard, the true guard, who were pouring through the doors now with half the awakened court behind them, and he said, "Lord Victor is under arrest for treason against the crown. He will have what he never gave, a trial, public, lawful, and fair." And the kingdom that had feared the Ice King for 20 years watched him hand his own would-be destroyer, disarmed and unharmed, into the law's hands, and understood at last, all at once, what old Marin had known from the beginning, and Grace had learned in a firelit room, that his coldness had only ever been a wall, and the wall was down, and what had lived behind it all along was this. The trial, when it came, was thorough and calm and devastating. Peter the young guard, freed and healing and stubborn as ever, testified to what had been done to him and what he had overheard. The gray little clerk offered honesty or ruin, chose honesty at great length. The planted candle and book and lock of hair were traced to the hands that placed them, and Lord Edwin, deeply embarrassed, showed the court how paint and pepper oil had been applied to his arm by a servant he had trusted, and the sharp-faced woman who had once run the royal household discovered that all her stored poison could not help her under oath. Victor listened to the whole architecture of his life read aloud with his warm smile in place, and was stripped of title, lands, and name, and sent to spend the rest of his days in a comfortable, escape-proof keep on the northern coast, where, it was reported, he predicted the weather daily to his guards and was usually right, and no one ever asked him for a prediction about anything else. The kingdom itself needed healing next, and the king healed it the way Grace had taught him, without ever teaching him. Openly. The sealed histories were unsealed. The truth about the Western Valley was read into the record of the realm by the king himself, standing before the full council, naming his father's crime as a crime, the first ruler in the history of the crown to indict his own blood, and when the old lords muttered that it dishonored the throne, he answered that a throne which could not survive the truth deserved to fall, and the muttering stopped, because the young packs and the border packs and the common wolves of 100 territories heard what he had done and gave the crown something it had not held in 3 generations, not fear, trust. The Valley of the Lunaris was rebuilt. Not as a monument, Grace would not allow that, but as a living place, the White Temple raised again around its mended bell tower, the archives restored from Marin's impossible memory, and Iris's guarded fragments, and the 2 old blind women were carried there in honor, and installed as the temple's twin terrors, interviewing candidates, and young women came from every territory, girls with strange gifts and nowhere to belong, and found a door open. The Order of the Moon was reborn 11 strong in its first year, under the guidance of its last true-born daughter, and on the night the new bell rang for the first time, the sound rolled down the valley over the white stones, and Grace stood among the graves of her grandmothers, and let the tears come freely, because she could now, because her tears had been given back to her, as what they had always truly been, not a curse, but an inheritance. She and Adrian were married in that valley the following spring, beneath the old moon-apple tree that had been carried south, uprooted whole from the palace garden at the king's absurd, unbudgeable insistence, and replanted by the temple gate, where it thrived. The wedding broke every royal tradition. It was held outdoors, under the full moon, in the Lunaris rite, forbidden for 20 years, and now spoken aloud by the king of the continent himself, who had, after all, learned it first in secret long ago, for a sadder purpose, and who stood beneath the tree and said the old words to the last daughter of the order, without a single mistake. Half the crowns of the neighboring realms attended. So did an entire delegation from the Black Moon Pack, deeply nervous, bearing extravagant gifts, and Grace received them with a graciousness that cost her more than anyone watching could guess, and old Nora the cook wept through the whole ceremony, and was seated, at the personal instruction of the Queen, in the first row. Queen. The word followed Grace strangely for years, like a coat that had been made for someone taller, and then one ordinary morning it simply fit. Queen Grace, the Luna of the realm, who kept her mother's dented locket on a shelf by her mirror, and who was known in every territory for 2 unbreakable habits. She learned the name of every servant in any hall she entered, and she could not, would not, ever pass a raised hand without stopping it. The locket opened, in the end. It opened on the morning her first child was born, a daughter, in the queen's own chamber, with the windows open to the garden, and whether it was the goddess's timing, or only an old clasp finally worn through, no one could say. But as the bells began to ring, the little silver door that no knife had ever moved swung open on its own. And inside, preserved in a circle of glass, lay a curl of dark hair and a scrap of paper smaller than a thumbnail, covered in her mother's writing, in the old language, which Grace could read now. It said, "For the granddaughter I will not meet. We were never cursed, my darling. We were entrusted." And Grace sat with her daughter in her arms and the note in her hand, and understood that her mother had known everything, always, and had sealed hope inside the fear, where it could survive the years. And she laughed and wept at the same time, and the tears that fell on the baby's blanket shone faintly silver, and did nothing but dry, because they had fallen, at last, on a world with no debt in it. Adrian came running when he heard she was weeping. because some habits outlive their reasons. He stopped in the doorway and saw his wife and his daughter in the morning light, and Grace looked up at the man her tears had once struck down, the frozen king, the burning king, the healed king, standing helpless and undone in the door of an ordinary happy room, and she held out her hand, palm up, open, asking, the way he had once done with the last of his strength, and he crossed the room and took it. Far to the south, in the green valley, the temple bell rang the birth across the graves of the grandmothers, and the wind moved through the moon apple tree by the gate, and if the old stories are right, and in that kingdom they usually were, the goddess looked down that morning at the long account of an old crime and a long grief, at judgment given, and answered, and paid in full, and closed the book, and was content. For the tears of the broken, say the Lunaris to this day, are the strongest thing under the moon. They can bring down a king, or they can raise one, and sometimes, if the heart behind them is willing, and whole, and true, they can do both to the same man, and hand him back his life, and call it love.